Liquid Bliss Worldwide.
Greg, first off, tell me when to stop. We're picking you an angel card. It's going to be a word for you for the interview. So tell me when to stop.
How about now?
Okay. So Elizabeth, who films us, and Stephen, who you met, the co-host, who you already know. Stephen, or I picked Grace. Elizabeth picked inspiration, and Stephen, what was yours?
Authenticity.
And Stephen picked authenticity. So then your word, Greg, is faith. So faith is going to be the underlying word for this interview. Right now, off the bat, it's just have faith in me. I care about you. I love you. We've been talking about this for 16 years. And so here's what I'm going to say for the next 10 minutes. So this is Greg Ridgway. He is my father-in-law. He is one of the most important humans in my life. Things between Greg and I have been real, a father-in-law, son-in-law. Sometimes we get along, sometimes we didn't. We both love his daughter more than anything, though. And we have that in common. And for 16 years, he and I have bonded, and we've bonded hard. We've been through a lot, and we've come out the other end. And that's how we know there's real love, because it hasn't always just been, hey, it's so great. We've been through the ringer. So when I met Greg, it's just going to come out perfectly as it is. Okay. So Greg Ridgway found out in 2001 that his brother might possibly be a serial killer, which we knew was untrue because he had already been he'd passed lie detector tests. It just wasn't the case. So Greg and his wife, Doreen, defended their brother in a case. But then in about 2 years later, in 2003, the evidence against his brother became irrefutable from someone like Greg, who comes from a scientific standpoint and understands what happened is there's a paint chip. The person worked for a trucking company, an 18-wheeler company that has a very specific kind of paint that's only used to paint 18-wheelers. He knew his brother worked for that company for 20 years. So he's like, oh no, this is probably irrefutable now. And so obviously, those of you who are tuning in right now already know the name of the episode. So it's not like we're teasing something you don't already know. I'm still just introducing it this way. So my father-in-law, Greg, because this is Greg's story, we're going to get to everything. But my father-in-law, Greg, being the brother that he was and seeing that evidence, talked to his brother and said, hey, listen, we've been defending you for 2 years. We got your back, but this is irrefutable now. You have to tell the truth. You have to confess that you did this. And if you confess, Doreen and I, his wife, we will not bail on you in this life. You're my brother. We'll have a human connection and we'll talk to you. We will stay connected to you. But maybe some families can be helped. If anything, it'll help you not die. And you need to confess this thing. And his brother confessed. His brother, turns out, is Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. He killed over 80 street children / teenagers who were runaways / prostitutes over the course of 20 years, most of it being in the early 80s, 1982, 1983, 1984. 20 years later was when all of this came into Greg's life. And we're going to go through that, but I'm going to get you guys up to date on where we are. And so this is just me kind of going to start doing it. So Greg got his brother to confess. And that created a maelstrom of interesting dynamics. On the one hand, now other families can get a little bit more information. They were able to get Gary for 54, I think, confessions. It's just with serial killers like that on that level in the 80s, when everything was happening on that kind of level, you can't know the numbers. It could be 100. It could be 80. It doesn't matter. It's just that most of the action was in the early 80s, 82, 83. But up until 2001, I'm sure there was, me being an addict, coming from the background I come from. It's probably other things that have happened. But again, that's not the point of this podcast. The point is that my father-in-law carries this. My mother-in-law, Doreen, carries this. Doreen was a high-powered paralegal who worked for the top lawyers in Seattle. So when her brother-in-law, Greg's brother, Gary, was accused, and because they knew he'd passed the lie detector before, Gary had been a suspect briefly in the 80s, and he's just a mild-mannered guy. He's not the kind of guy who's going to do that. So she was able to get very good lawyers for Gary, and they put themselves in the gap, like Gandalf with the Balrog. You know, we know the truth. We will defend our family. So when you do that, it's a big energetic when all of a sudden 2 years in, some, technology catches up and there's like this irrefutable evidence, and Greg has to stand in that energy. And now he has to take the energy of the entire city of Seattle, because, like any big case of like in Seattle, like any big city where this has been going on for 20 years, and it's a whole mythos about the entire thing. And listen, before I go on any further, because I think I have a certain energy in my voice right now, we understand what happened to the victims. And so where I'll cut to right now is saying, when I met my wife 16 years ago, she was very broken. She was like a valedictorian, piano aficionado, soccer star in college, just a really lovely person who, after this happened with her uncle, it was like, oh, you're the niece of the serial killer. It's like, how could it be that like it's not even her, it's her uncle, but yet the family members of these people are affected. And so when I met my wife, and she said, I have something to tell you about my family, I don't know if it's going to be a deal breaker for you. I was like, oh my God, like I've had my own past. You guys know my past. If you listen to this podcast, you know my past. And I was like, no, I understand that. And then I met Greg and Doreen, and there's these beautiful humans who I know are still like, I can see the wound there. I'm a shamanic guy, right? I can see that. At the same time, they're fine. They're doing their thing. But Gary calls, and they have to contain that energy still. And they didn't get kicked out of Seattle. But you know what? I just noticed that my mother-in-law, she wasn't able to keep working for those lawyers. Somehow she's like, it's just a weird energy. And these political cartoonists who talk about the case back and forth, they want this guy to die. And by confessing, now he has a chance at life in prison. And that's what happened for him. And my father-in-law has to carry all that energy too. Like what? Is he like somehow has to take I don't know. Is whatever all of it is that's the Ridgway family that I got to be a part of. My own father died when I was 51. So it's very easy to find a father in Greg. And part of the initiation of a father and son is to grapple with each other. And we did that. But we both loved Kristen. We both loved each other. So all that to say is, in 2014, I told my wife, they're going to tell this story someday. It's Hollywood. My wife and I are in Hollywood. And my wife created the Feel Good Film Festival, which is like energetically was her way of kind of like energetically combating the energy of whatever her uncle did. Like it's even her problem. She created this beautiful film festival in LA with a yellow carpet, and it was dedicated to movies that felt good. Like Rainn Wilson hosted it the first year from The Office, Dwight. It was just beautiful. And Greg and Doreen were there, but that's not the point either. It's that in 2014, because my wife worked as a producer and in the documentary field in Hollywood, she had an opportunity to produce a film for Lifetime and A&E called My Uncle is the Green River Killer. Lifetime is a very female-centric one, so they wanted her to be the face of it, and she allowed that to be. This isn't Greg's story, though. This is their story. Greg really didn't want to be a part of it as much as he's like, you know what? I know what they do here. They're going to tell the same story about my brother. They're going to cut and slice everyone into pieces. It's not going to be a true story. I don't want to do that kind of crap. My mother-in-law had all the archives, being the paralegal she was. For 2 years, she had archived everything. She had every picture, every article. She had the whole case, everything that a network could ever want. And so they had that trove offered to them, pictures, they had everything. And the documentary became like their signature piece. They were so proud of it that they actually I had my wife, how do I say it? Like every network you can nominate one of your projects for an Emmy and maybe they'll consider it. So they were like, hey, let's put Kristen for docuseries. Let's my wife didn't get nominated for an Emmy, but just knowing that they put her out there as one to represent like their network as possibility that year, it was just a really good documentary for the network. I'm sure they made millions off it, and no sweat to them. They were amazing. It's all good. It's just my wife is a producer in docuseries, and we know how this works. And they created a whole branch. Like they had a whole, like this opened them up to like a lot of other families contributing and like creating whole series around this stuff. And that's beautiful, but it's also one of those things. And the reason I'm saying it this way is because there's also a certain like thing. Every actor wants to play a serial killer and win an Oscar. You know, these guys do a documentary and it leads into like them being able to get themselves deeper into that world and make money. And I'm not saying they're not doing good things, but that's what happened with my father-in-law at the same time. All the amazing police officers and the people who are on this case, it's not about that. It's just there's a bureaucracy around all that. And the sheriff, right, I don't remember his name. Greg will tell us later. The one who was on the case forever. You know, he's a congressman now. He wrote his book. No, this guy's been through hell for 20 years, sure. But the acknowledgement of how this world works is that dynamic is folded into it. And it's something that for my father-in-law, what do you do with that too? That's compounded into it. Like, I don't know that I love this guy who's a congressman now. There's an energy that somehow he's like the actor who plays the serial killer to win the Oscar. What is that? That's kind of using something for your own means. And somehow, you know, my brother, yes, I understand who Gary Ridgway is. My dad understands who Gary Ridgway is. But these people are humans and they become who they become for a lot of reasons. And my father knows those reasons. He'll tell you about Vietnam and what happened to Gary in Vietnam. He'll tell you about what happens when the GIs sleep with prostitutes and, you know, there's a sexual addiction attached to it. He'll tell you how when you come back and then Gary sees his wife, you know, with another man and he feels the humiliation about that, how that might put you over the edge if you're already predisposed and there might be a trigger point. I did psychedelics too young and it triggered a manic depression in me. Like, I don't know. We don't need to get into too much of the early psychology and guess on it too much because we don't have to, because Greg knows the components that he knows that factored in, and he'll speak on childhood. He'll speak about all of that. But where I'm going with this is that these so-called monsters that we want to say, these monster killing children. This is a fantastic comic book called Something's Killed the Children. And it's about this girl, Erica Slaughter. Only kids can see monsters, but she can go and she can kill the monsters. I wore this shirt because it's a disturbing shirt. It's called Something's Killing the Children. It was my favorite comic book during COVID, and it'd probably be a series. But my point is that the term monster is what they call everything to do with human beings that are on this planet like this. I think Charlize Theron's movie was called Monster. So, okay, we know this. We know they're monsters. Can we move beyond it and try to understand who these humans are and what factors into it so that we can understand and prevent things in the future for our children, for anyone out there that has some kind of like gene that could be triggered and who knows what? Can we not humanize them so that we can forgive them and take anything away from victims? Can we do it so we can evolve as humans and understand things deeper? That's what Liquid Bliss is all about. That's why my father-in-law is willing to be here and talk to us. And that's why I'll be whatever emotion I want to be during this interview. Otherwise, it's dismissed. And my father-in-law will not be dismissed this time. He gets to tell his story, and however long it takes. If it's 2 hours, which I hope it is, we'll cut it into 2 parts. Because this story is what should be told. All right. And you got all the rest. There's so many documentaries on Gary. Go check them out. Hey, check out the My Uncle's Green River Killer. That's good too. They've made TV movies about him. I'm sure someday they'll make an Oscar movie about him. That's not about him. This is about Greg Ridgway, my father, who would like to tell his story for the first time. So, Greg, I want to thank you for being here and trusting me for 16 years, and especially now even, to do this story with you. I will treat it with the respect it deserves, and I will take it to the stars wherever it needs to go to tell your story, however far this needs to go. Until Hollywood makes a movie about my brother's Green River Killer. This is about doing it now in 2025 in authentic ways only. We rewrite the script. We tell them the story they're going to tell. So thanks for letting me share. That was a lot more than 10 minutes.
That's wonderful. It's good. It's good to hear your validation of the entire issue, I don't know what you want to call it, but I'm very uncomfortable and on this side of the camera. I'm sorry. I love taking photos, but I certainly don't like being on this side of it. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, not to be corrective, but to be a little bit more explanatory about the 80s. with my brother. There was a lot on the family dynamic that happened in the 80s that nobody knows anything about, and you already alluded to a little bit of it. The Vietnam issue, certainly my military experience, my brother's military experience. All three of us were in Vietnam.
There's a third brother, Ed, the youngest.
Yeah, and he too was in a combat zone. He was actually in Vietnam. Gary was he was in the Navy, so he was on a vessel offshore. I was in Korea, but people don't realize or understand that Korea was also a war zone, even 15 years after the Korean conflict. So it was a very turbulent time for anybody who happened to be in their late teens and early 20s. I was 21. I was a little old for that conflict, but I entered because the environment put me in a position where I got a degree in physics, so I understand complex topics. But
Greg, real quick, is there a TV on in the background?
In the other room.
Yeah, we're picking it up.
Oh, okay. I'll get it.
He's watching sports. So Greg actually is in Oregon right now. When they left Seattle, they built a home in Oregon in Klamath Falls. So they're retired now, and every piece of this home in Klamath Falls was built with Greg's construction and architect, and and so he's doing this podcast from his safe space in Oregon, and he loves sports. And that sounds like it was a game on. Was it a game on that you were watching?
I wasn't actually watching that particular game, but I had it on to cancel some time. Yeah,
so that's kind of cool. Game. Yeah. All right. So anyway, go ahead. We didn't interrupt you, but I'm just incorporating the fact that my favorite thing to do with my dad is watch games, and my sons love watching games with them too. All right. So what was it like in the 80s?
Well, that's much what it was. In part, it was a mixture of environmental issues that you and I have talked about. Some of the societal issues, some of the military issues. They all kind of came together during the Vietnam conflict. We're talking about the result of actually Vietnam had already been over by the beginning of the 80s, but this all really started a few years before 1980. And that's when certainly a lot of the problems with my brother, both brothers, and myself began to surface. It was just a lot of stress. What I think I was about ready to say is, I was studying at the University of Washington to get a degree in physics, and I just was staring at books, just one page for 5 minutes at a time, and rereading it and not digesting anything, which is just kind of a symptom of stress overload, like a lot of young men did back during that time period. So I had to make a decision of either flunk out of college or move on, and I ended up joining my two brothers who at that time had already entered the service. I wasn't in the Vietnam conflict, but the environment for all of us young men was encircled by and wrapped in this aura that would be the environment of the time, and it was oppressive. It was negative. I mean, death was in the air, so to speak. I mean, I don't know that it was that dramatic, but you had acquaintances you went to high school with that would come back from Vietnam and get run over by a car or whatever. I mean, it just seemed like everything around us was foodbar, kind of like I'm supposing we're going to get with our new president here in the next coming days. But that's kind of the environment we were involved in. And I, in particular, when I ended up going into the military in 69 and through 71, I was in a top secret missile field in the military, and that was very oppressive as well. I was a flower child coming out of college. Basically, I could have been one of those Kent State kids that put a flower in the muzzle of a rifle, but that was certainly not my lot in life. But I didn't fit. I didn't fit in the military. I'm not sure that any one of the three of us brothers fit in the military establishment at the time. And he was involved in a horrific struggle societal as well. I mean, it was probably the most hated war we've ever been involved in. And it permeated the entire environment. And I don't want to make this all about Vietnam. It really isn't. It's about the societal
No, but it's a key
issues.
part. This is that part of it.
It's the part of it that, and nobody got a break. I mean, the three of us boys, all three of us were in combat zone at the same time. I mean, I'm sure the military would like to have said, well, yeah, Korea doesn't count. Well, it does. People were dying there. You know, I was awakened at 3 a.m. in a foxhole one night because of North Korean insurgents tried to take over the base next to us. So, yeah, we were involved in a lot of that oppressive, emotional, overbearing kind of stuff. And Gary was involved with that too. My youngest brother, Tom Edward, was he was in Vietnam at the age of 15 and a half.
Okay, so let's talk about Ed. What happened with Ed? So he somehow got in at 15 and a half. Was it through the draft or did he sign up?
He signed up, lied about his age, didn't tell his parents. You know, the military at that point in time, they didn't care. They didn't look beyond the paper you signed.
Especially if he was willing to do it and signed up. They didn't draft him.
No, anybody who had a heartbeat could be in the military. If you had a physical ailment or a physical defect, they wouldn't want to take you. But I've served along guys that had flat feet and everything else because at that point in time, in the later years of Vietnam, they didn't care what your physical problems were.
Why did Ed want to go?
I think he just wanted to get away. He'd been involved in a situation and you know, I don't think you and I have even talked about this. I thought about it the other day that
I think you told me. Keep going.
He actually, younger than 15 and a half, he actually ended up getting a woman pregnant.
Yeah, I think you told me this once. So that happened when he was like 14?
You know, I don't really know the date. All I know is I was around. Get a call from my dad and he says, you and Gary and I are going to go get Ed because he fled the house and he was living with this gal and they had a child.
Oh, they did have it.
Yeah, my dad actually did what you could do back then. He just came in and grabbed my brother and grabbed the furniture out of the house they just bought and took it home.
So, okay. So what do you mean your dad took them? Like your dad kind of took Ed back home?
Yeah, he
separated it from the girlfriend and the baby.
I'm sorry. He literally grabbed me as the driver and I refused to go into the house because I didn't agree with what was going on. But when your dad tells you he wants you to do something, you know, you do it. So
Ed gets taken out of the house and then separated from that situation. Like, we are not doing this. You're not going to be 15 years old and with some girl and having a baby. So he grabs Ed to bring Ed home. And that creates Ed doesn't know how to process that. And then within a year enlists himself to go to Vietnam. And you think probably, and I think you're right, I think you're onto something, probably as a result of what happened here with this woman and this baby, and then however that dynamic worked.
Well, and as I've talked before, the way back during that time period, raising 3 young boys, all entering puberty roughly at the same time, we were pretty well siloed. In other words, we didn't really relate or get involved with each other's life situation any more than was absolutely necessary. That's the only way my mom could deal with us all going in different directions at the same time and her trying to work as a professional and try to make ends meet. But that's
what was she doing for a living? Is this when she was a seamstress for Sears?
She wasn't actually a seamstress. That was Joanne's mom that was a seamstress. My mom, if you go back to her early years when she was a young woman, she was a donut dolly. We talked about that. She was in World War II in Bremerton. she was one of those gals that would go to the dances on the Navy base, and they'd have donuts and coffee or whatever, and dance with the GIs before they went to World War II. So that was her upbringing. But when we got older and we were able to kind of coexist on our own as latchkey kids, Mom was working in dress shops, in learner stores, I think they were called back then. There were little independent dress shops, and she worked in those. And
so, well, then she was at work. Your dad was that when he was bus driving, or he was doing any kind of different kind of jobs?
Well, he was basically, in those years, he was doing anything that he could, anything from driving a truck with a sheep trailer on the back of it and moving sheep and cattle around, or working for farmers, or because he preferred it, heavy construction driving, Caterpillar, earth movers and that kind of thing. But that was seasonal work in southern Idaho. That's where we lived at the time. So during the winter, he had to do anything he possibly could
So your mom and dad were working. So you guys were like latchkey kids. And the best way your mom really knew. Okay, so what's the difference? Is it 2 years between you and Gary? You was the oldest, and then 2 years between Gary and Ed? Is it 2 years, 2 years?
2 years.
Probably, right? Maybe 3 years?
3 and a year and a half with Gary and I. We were
right. You guys
close.
are kind of like that Irish twins energy, that 16 months apart, like Desmond and Tiger Lily. And then Ed came along more in that Revel thing, the third kid. Those are my kids. Not that you don't know that. The viewers must know that who watch me. Anyway, my point from that is asking, so your mom knew how to kind of silo you guys off into different worlds so you didn't fight, so that she could go to work and know that somehow you guys wouldn't necessarily fight, or you'd have your own things you do. And it would, I can understand it. It minimizes kind of possible problems coming up if you guys are all kind of in your own little worlds. So is that right? Is that how you're describing being siloed off?
Yeah, that's why we were siloed off.
So if Greg likes reading sci-fi books and making models, he'll do it. But if Gary likes reading, everyone can kind of do their own thing. If Ed wants to be outside shooting BB guns, but it's not like, but it was a way of kind of all you were a little bit separated.
Oh yeah, we were definitely separated. I mean, it got to the point that, one of my younger brothers or the other, either one of them was end up, throwing a steel ball at me and hit me on the ground while I'm laying in the grass or whatever. I mean, we just simply didn't get along. I mean,
that's why your mom and dad, who had to work anyway, tried to make this situation livable for the three of you. Now, do you know why you think you didn't get along even at that young age? Was it typical sibling rivalry, or do you think it might have been something like, actually, you know what? We really didn't like each other even more than the usual siblings. Because my kids fight and all, but did you have that same love underneath? Or you would say, like, you know what? I honestly wasn't connected to my brothers in that way like your grandkids are. Like, what is it? Because kids fight. So what's the difference?
I think it was too easy for when we got older and we got into this Vietnam era. It was easy for me to walk away from my brothers. I didn't have that much in common with them. And by then we'd been 10 years of this or thereabouts, 8 to 10 years of kind of living together but living apart. I mean, we got together for dinner, but that was it. Sat down and ate food and went about doing our thing. So,
yeah,
the home life, we didn't really have, since my dad was always gone, we never had an opportunity to sit around the table like a lot of families do and just talk about what you did during the day or didn't do during the day or whatever. Was it like TV dinners, or did she cook a meal? Mom was a good cook. She cooked. I mean, everything was cooked in 2 cast iron fry pans. I mean, she had to cook for 3 hungry boys, as you know. Yeah. You know how that is. Yeah. It was. She was when she wasn't working. She was basically, feeding us.
So when Ed ended up enlisting into Vietnam, was he the third brother to enlist, or did you guys all enlist, or did some of you how did military come for you and for Gary?
I was the last to enlist, I believe, because I was trying. Okay. I was in my second year, just near the end of my second year in college. I was beginning my third year because I had spent 2 years at a junior college. So I couldn't afford the tuition at University of Washington, so I got my first 2 years in a community college, and then I transferred my credits to the UW. So that's kind of how it went for me.
And Ed was already in the military.
I found that out later. Yeah, I didn't know
because you guys
right
weren't
away.
that connected. Oh, that's interesting. So then let's cut to keep with the Ed thread. What happened to Ed? Because something went haywire for Ed in the military, and that was how long did he serve? 2 years.
He never made it that far.
Okay.
Ed got involved with. It's hard to say this without sounding like I'm bashing the military, and I'm not. I'm bashing the system. He was in a he was a mechanic, and he was in a battalion level. What do you call it? Where they have all the equipment. Working on Jeeps and Deuce-Nass and all that kind of stuff. But he was 15 and a half, and the way they did it in Vietnam at that point in time, there was so much turnover and so much attrition that it was easy for the powers that be, the sergeants, to just walk away and not do their job. And I don't know what the sergeant was doing, but he took a guy who was only one grade in rank above my brother and put him in charge.
Wow.
That was a PFC, which means you've got when you go in the military, you're an E1, then you're an E2, and then you're an E3. And E3 is a PFC, and Ed was an E2 right out of basic training, and he had a PFC in charge of him, who was another wet behind the ears, kid in charge of another kid, and apparently they didn't get along. And my brother Ed got all the ship duty. He got all the guard duty. He had every day. He had to inspect the vehicles every night, which meant they have rounds like a security guard would do, and they go in there and inspect the equipment because they were literally in the heart of a combat zone. And they were taking on mortar fire on a fairly regular basis. So when he wasn't, ducking for cover from incoming fire, he was out making sure the vehicles didn't have incendiary devices planted in them by the Viet Cong. So he was busy doing that kind of stuff.
And so he understood how incendiary devices worked.
Well, yeah, sure. Everybody who goes through your basic training learns that. You learn how to handle a hand grenade. You learn how to handle that kind of stuff. And then you get very streetwise over there when you're put in a position where you know what to look for. When you know what to look for, you know how to counter that. You know how to look for tripwires. You know how to look for the kind of things that would be attached to a hand grenade, or the kind of things that would be attached to what's called a claymore. I mean, those things are all things you have to learn to survive to get through basic training. And he knew that stuff, and he'd taken enough abuse from this guy who was just one rank above him, and he decided to plant a hand grenade, an incendiary grenade, not a fragmentary grenade, but one that he put on the passenger side of the vehicle. And part of this inspection process is you go along and you open the driver's side door and make sure that there's nothing planted in there that, or watch for incendiary devices and stuff. Well, he deliberately planted an incendiary grenade in this truck, and he tied a wire to the door handle so that when his boss opened the door,
the one he resented, the one that they'd had friction all the time,
this tripwire pulled a pin out of the grenade, and that wire flew across the face of his boss. And of course, he saw that immediately, because that's what you look for when you want to make sure there's no nothing going on like that. So he immediately hit the ground, knowing that he would probably be protected, That's what you're taught to do. And it blew the top part of the vehicle, blew the cab off of it. It was a big Jeep, is what it was, and caused $2,200 worth of damage. But not that things weren't bad enough.
But the guy was okay?
Guy was fine, didn't get a scratch on him. And of course, that immediately put him up for court-martial.
Yeah.
And that's when good went to bad, because he was given, they had just rewritten military laws. It's called UCMJ, Uniform Code of Military Justice. Anyway, they had just rewritten that because it wasn't working well. It was after the My Lai massacre in Vietnam, when a guy could literally go around and kill people and not have any consequence. So they changed the laws on that. But anyway, what they did is they changed it so that it was supposed to be more fair for a guy to get tried and get a fair shake. Didn't work out that way in his case, because he got a corrupt judge. And in the military, a judge is just an officer. You have to be a JAG officer. He's supposed to, it's like a lawyer that's a judge. But this guy gave him his options, and there are five different ways you can be tried. And I won't go into all that, but the first and the easiest one to sell, if you're a used car salesman, is buy the car from me. You know me already. Why don't you just go ahead and buy the car from me? I'll give you the best deal. Well, that's the kind of sales pitch he got from this judge. And he said, hey, don't worry. I understand everything. I read they have a transcript of this entire proceedings. And I read that transcript, and he was given a bum shake from the very beginning, because the judge knew he was going to be the one that was going to actually court-martial him. So he was set up from the very beginning. He didn't know it. He was too stupid.
So then that's where his military career ends. So then what was Gary's Vietnam experience like then? So what was it like for Gary, where he was? Because Gary was in a different zone now. What was Gary's zone? He saw, he was, yeah.
Dan, on one hand, was mistreated by the military directly. Gary wasn't so much. He was in the Navy on a cruiser or something offshore in Vietnam, and had a typical Navy career, although he did try to become a Navy SEAL, which meant he did try to go into SEALs training. He never talked about it much, because I think he was sworn to secrecy about that, kind of like me with my top secret clearance. He just didn't talk about it. But he later on, well after he was put in handcuffs and was being interrogated, he did say he learned some things in the Navy that taught him how to take care of the young ladies the way he did. He was very remorseful about it. Yeah, he said, I learned techniques in the Navy that he says, I swore I wouldn't tell anybody about it, and I swore I wouldn't use it, but he did. So he had special techniques he felt he learned in the Navy that enabled him to silently carry about his judge and jury behavior. So that's all I know about it. All I know is I know he had an MO like all serial killers do. But
yeah, but so then also he had his military. Okay, so at the same time, he's also a regular GI. So whenever there's leave, it's Vietnam or wherever he's stationed, and he's going to maybe local prostitutes and doing that thing that was happening in the 60s and 70s with American GIs or whatever. So he also, which we bypassed, when he was younger, he did have quite a way with the ladies. It wasn't like he was unable, like he really had, he loved girls. He had, not an addiction, but it was like much more so than like, more so than you, right? Gary always had kind of that energy too, right? He liked to kind of see how far he could go. Like he liked to go like sleep with women. I mean, like, you know what I mean? He was like, it was his thing, right? He was having fun.
Yeah, he didn't make any bones about it. He
Didn't make any bones about it.
As you and I have talked before, he, any port in a storm, so to speak, any place, anytime, anywhere, he wasn't afraid to use his influence with young women. So in high school and even before, he, literally between houses was fine as far as he was concerned. So, and he did have an appetite that I never understood how aggressive it was, but it was very aggressive. And he had a way with the women. He had a way with, he was the guy that no matter when we were in high school and early first year of college, him and a friend of ours, one of my best friend's brothers, those two younger guys always ended up getting the gals. We didn't. We had to go back and sleep in the car, and they were out on the beach somewhere with the ladies. So that's just the way it was. He never had any issues. So
I can imagine when he's on active duty, anytime he gets leave and can go there, he's had all this pent up energy, right? High stress level, whether he's training to be a Navy SEAL or whatever environment, it's a military environment. And our boys need to cut loose. They need to have some drinks afterwards or whatever. So we never fault whatever GIs are doing. That's war. It's something we don't understand unless you're in war. But at the same time, given who he was, that became probably a source of every kind of way that he could relieve himself of stress and whatever was probably prostitutes, women. I'm guessing on this. This is just conjecture, but it comes from a place of knowing kind of human nature and being an actor of 20 years and kind of just empathizing and understanding that if I had to play Gary Ridgway someday, you have to kind of understand where things come from. So I imagine that was probably because it ended up being later in life. I'm sure the Vietnam and the prostitute section started in the Vietnam section. I'm betting you'd probably agree. I don't think he saw prostitutes probably before Vietnam, maybe, but I doubt it. He was too young.
No, he didn't need to.
He didn't need to.
Never need any. He had all the young ladies he needed in high school and whatever, or at dances or whatever. He was him and, like I said, this other friend, they always had all the women they could ever want. And I understand, I can speak for Korea because I don't think it was much different in Vietnam as far as prostitution goes. It was very abused, very misused. The GIs took advantage of the women on a regular basis. There was a very strong, minority influence in the military. Candidly, there was 80% black during the Vietnam time period, and at least in my experience in Korea, there was not a lot of respect for women who were prostitutes at any level in the military. If you went to visit prostitutes, they were just, excuse my language, were just a piece of meat to be used. They didn't
That's
care.
how it was seen. So that's an environment that now given, if you're going to kind of really look at Gary in the fullest. So that's he has now permission to view women that way. That's what it was like. That was the climate of the place. And then he came home. We're going to cut to when he came home from Vietnam, where while he was gone, his second wife, Marcia?
First wife.
That's his first wife, who was kind of a love of his life. And she cheated on him in kind of a publicly humiliating fashion for Gary. And that was also a black gentleman. And so there's also a race component in there. And Gary, you said, I feel like, well, go ahead and tell me. So what was that situation that happened with Marcia?
Well, it goes all the way back to World War II. There's a term in the military called the Dear John letter. And Gary, at some point, I believe before he came back stateside, he received a letter in the mail. And the letter in the mail basically said, "Hi, hon, bye." She walked out on him. And when she walked out on him when he was fighting for his life, she walked out on him with another man, and happened to be a minority young man. And I don't know whether Gary had feelings towards blacks or not. It was very common during that time period. There was a lot of strife going on for whites and blacks during that time period, and there was a lot of conflict in Korea between blacks, whites, and Koreans. So there was a lot of racial tension throughout the military. And it's easy when you're under that kind of stress to take your anger out on somebody. And it's usually not someone of your same race. It's usually taking it out on somebody else. I mean,
did Gary divorce her right after that happened, or was he willing to forgive her, or she wanted to leave him, or they didn't divorce then, or like, it was a Dear John letter saying she's gone. She said, "I'm gone."
Yeah, I think she just filed for divorce and ran out. I don't even know when that happened. All I know is she wasn't around anymore when he got out. So, and he wasn't happy about it, obviously. But.
So then who was his second wife?
Second, I was describing how Ed kept getting the short end of the stick in the military. Well, Gary kept getting the short end of the stick when it came to women. His first wife walks out on him with
the Dear John letter.
Guy, and gets a Dear John letter, and then Gary comes back and finds another woman. And he decides, well, I'm not going to marry this young, blonde, petite gal. I'm going to marry this 60-pound overweight gal. So
this is the second wife?
Yep, Marcia.
If the pretty, petite, blonde girl cheats on me, maybe this girl who carries more weight and isn't as attractive to every man will stay loyal to me. And so it's that kind of a thing? What was her name?
That was Marcia. That was the second wife.
Who was the first wife?
I don't know. I think it was Claudia or something like that.
Oh, yeah, Claudia. Okay, so that was Marcia. The one who cheated on him in Vietnam, that was Claudia, or whatever the first wife's name was.
And then Marcia decides, well, she has Gary's child, and she happened to be the kind of an individual who really believed in alimony and things like that, and believed that the father takes care of the child. And this
is Gary. Gary has one child, and this is your nephew. Right. This is your nephew Matthew, Kristen's cousin Matthew.
And Gary loved him and wanted to spend time with him, and did everything he could for him. But unfortunately, Marcia kept holding the son up as hostage. Every time it came time to pay alimony or not pay alimony. Gary's one of the few people at the time I know that was actually paying child support. He was actually paying child support on a monthly basis. But before he could bring Matthew home to his house to spend some time with him on a weekend, she'd say, well, he needs a new bed, or he needs this, or he needs that. So she kept holding Matthew up as hostage time after time after time. I kept over.
So when he married Marcia, she was heavy set, but then she dropped weight. Is that what you had said?
She didn't just drop weight. She went out and had an operation that had 6 inches of her colon removed. So she became more attractive and desirable to other men, and she cheated too. Is that what happened? I don't know whether she cheated for sure or not, but they basically did not get along, and she basically told him to go to hell. And
so it didn't have anything to do with the weight loss. Or you think she had a new kind of empowered look about herself and just said, I don't know that Gary's the one. Hey, and again, I'm not saying anything about cheating. I'm not talking about wives. I'm not putting any blame on anyone or anything. I'm just trying to say it takes, like, Gary, obviously we know who he is. We know what he became. I would not want to be married to that man. I'm sure there was plenty of places where these women have perfectly good reasons to not be with Gary anymore. And I'm glad they weren't. I'm just saying we're discussing a man and we're exploring where a man's psyche went from this. And that's what we're talking about. So now that's the dynamic that's happening there. And this is a guy who can't take pressure. His release with pressure is probably sexual. And at this point now, he's probably come back from the war and he's going probably to a lot of, is this in Seattle? He's probably going to a lot of prostitutes already in Seattle. I don't know if he's killed yet, but things are moving forward in the escalation of Gary Ridgway and where he is. Now, at this point, is this 1982? Has he started yet? Has he started killing yet? Or is this right after Marcia?
Yeah, I don't know that I know the details of that. Because
it's about that time though, isn't it? Because I think it's 82 and his first victim is Wendy Caulfield.
Yeah, it's about that time. I'm not good with
no, I can help you. We did this whole documentary with my uncle, so I remember the dates.
But
my uncle Gary, not my actual uncle. Go ahead.
But anyway, she for like you just mentioned, for probably very sound reasons, could no longer live with Gary. But I don't think that's how he saw it. He just saw he just saw that he wasn't being properly allowed the rights to see and be with his son. Right. So, and he made a lot of mistakes in that area too. They talked a lot about how the fact he even had his son with him at one point in time when he was out hunting women. But
yeah, so if we do the time frame on that, because there was a point when he actually had taken a woman home and given her a ride in the car. Matthew was too young to realize what that situation was. They went out to a place in the woods. The girl Gary went off with the girl, told Matthew to stay in the car. Gary didn't come back with the girl, told Matthew that, she just got herself home, which was a little odd because it was probably a little far off the beaten path. At the same time, Matthew's a kid. It doesn't matter. But so this is when it's happening. And so that's why I'm wondering in hindsight how old Matthew was. I think that's on record, but is he 10 or is he 8? Whatever age he is he 12?
I think he's 8.
So at about 8 years old. So Lucas's age, basically, right? Lucas's age. That's Matthew. And Lucas would be savvy enough to be like, okay, I believe Dad, but also like, huh? And so Gary's in it now. So it's probably Marcia that was like where the murder started. I don't know if it was before or after Marcia or whatever it was, but by this time, these are the height, because I want to tell the audience how the height of Gary's spree was really 80 to 82. I think 83. It's where they believe he killed probably about 40 of his victims. Yeah, go ahead.
Another important factor about Marcia was that after she'd had this operation, she played a banjo or ukulele or something, and she was with one of those little country groups they have at some of the clubs in the area. And so after she lost her weight, she started spending a lot of time up on stage playing the band member, and apparently she received a lot of attention from the guys in the club. So
Gary, there you go.
Gary. I mean, when Gary married her, all he would talk about is how she's overweight, but she's a great cook, and she's a wonderful gal, and all that sort of stuff. And 2 years or so later, that's no longer the case. So
the only thing we have to go on that I've talked to you about over 16 years of how do we get into now where Gary's like on a spree and he's killing is there was so there's your childhood where you're kind of like everyone's kind of in their own silos, and something in that place is probably where Gary has too much time to himself to go haywire, right? Too much time with his thought, too much time, probably not enough time with his brothers, right? And so it's somewhere in that place where, he didn't do any psychedelics, right? There was nothing that snapped his brain that way, as far as you know. He just was a beer drinker, right? Because I was thinking psychedelics could snap it, but something snapped it to where was he a Christian at this point too? Because he got very religious about it too. I know there was an aspect of him that was like, how much does God care? They're prostitutes anyway. He had a religious fixation. I don't know if it was at that point or if it was after he was incarcerated, but the time I spent with him, he's very fixated with was God.
Yeah, that was very, very much after he was incarcerated. I have no idea what he was by this point in time. He was so good at masking himself. I don't think people ever knew the side of him that went south. I certainly never knew it.
So your mom and your dad are alive at this point. How much do you think, I don't know if Dad would have known much, but how much do you think Mom knew? What's always been interesting to me is that your mom, Grandma, was the fact that she passed away right before Gary was caught. And while that's just life and coincidence and synchronicity or whatever it is, it's an interesting aspect because that probably would have killed her anyway, to find out about your son. So there was almost this like a blessing almost that she wasn't alive for that. At the same time, I've often wondered, and this is me personally, if on some level, knowing who I am as a father, who Kristen is as a mother, who my mom is as a mother, if on some level the mother knew, do you think your mom had an inkling about that kind of thing? Because I do. I think her and Gary had an interest because, you know, she had a different relationship with each son. And I think she might have babied him or had something with him that I think she might have keyed in on with him. I think there was something to do. He obviously had a fixation about her that, like, you know, again, is a normal kind of maybe thing for boys or whatever. But I think something crossed for him too, where it became something about, I don't know where that ties into it, but it feels like I've always felt like your mom knew on some level, something. Did you ever get that sense, or you never thought about that?
Well, I can only share one particular instance that happened where, you know, mom always had a very succinct and very demanding. She had one rule, and the rule was real simple. You know, don't mess around with somebody you don't want to marry. You know, in other words, don't get anybody pregnant. Whether she knew that Gary had a propensity to do that, I don't think so, because she had no knowledge whatsoever that he had done some of the other things that he had done out of frustration with another boy in high school.
What was that?
That was where he was supposed to have knifed this kid and almost killed him. But that didn't come out until they started doing all the background checks.
See, that part is all fine and well. That reminds me similar to something like Ed doing an incendiary bomb in a Jeep. Like, that's not, I don't mean that's all fine and well, meaning that's okay to do. I just mean that is the level of engagement that sure, that can happen. But the fact where you start specifically targeting women and making it about this dynamic where sexuality is involved and it crosses over into the darkest parts of our humanity, where it becomes like bodies are like, he fits that profile of, you know, putting objects in orifices and revisiting the bodies later. And what, I forget what they call that when you have sex again later. It got to the deeper psychosis, which is why he's always studied and always looked at, because he is similar to like those serial killers on that level of like the pathos and the psychology ran very, very deep with Gary in a way that, like, that's where, like you said, this is your okay.
Let me interrupt you here briefly, because I think we called mom the warden at that point in time in our life, because she was the one that always was around to put her foot down and say no. And there were a number of cases where Gary had more gals than he could deal with in high school, and so he would want to have one of us, me in particular, come out and go on a date with him. Well, I only know of one case that happened, because mom wouldn't let it. Mom knew Gary was a sexual deviant. She knew it. But whether she knew that he had other urges or would break and start killing, I don't think she did. I don't
think she, yeah, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
I don't think that was not in her personality. I mean, she was a person who was there to, especially when she was younger. Like I said, she was a donut doll. She was there to support the GIs, to support the men, to do the best she could for society. I don't think that she would have. I don't think she would have allowed it. On the other hand, I don't think that Gary ever would have come out if she hadn't died.
Right.
I don't
think the confession would have ever happened. No way. That's why it is like life does what it's. Yeah.
Everybody on his defense team agreed. They said, no, there's no way he would have. If Mary had been alive, there's no way that Gary would have ever admitted to anything, because he respected her. He may not have liked her a lot of times. He may have been mad at her, but he respected her. I don't think she knew. I don't think she had a clue.
And again, I want to backtrack and make sure everyone knows I wasn't flippant when I talked about a sensitive subject like that, about the darkness of how Gary went through. I didn't mean to step on that quickly or even to disturb you, Greg. I don't want to come across analytical or not really understand what I say might land with you in a different way. And I want to just hold space and not apologize, but acknowledge that I saw what I did there. And that was maybe not quite, that was a kind of a direct way to say something that's a lot more complex, and I want to acknowledge that.
And I talked about it, and I agree. That's the first logical place people want to go is they want to say, well, he had mother issues. I don't think he did to that extent. I think his issues were all internal. I don't think it had anything to do with anybody outside of himself, because he could so quickly and so easily change his behavior. I mean, everybody on the defense and the prosecution team all thought that he had split personality. They all thought that he had. I mean, they sent him to a number of shrinks to try to, and they all come back and said, no, nothing wrong with this guy.
Yeah, and I think that was probably in the early 2000s. They didn't probably have, what they know now 20 years later, compared especially in the 80s when they were trying to capture him. And again, I want to make sure for time and for everything else, this isn't the story of Gary the Green River Killer. This is the story of his brother. So now let's kind of go ahead, and I think if we have to backtrack, we will. But let's cut to, because we're talking about the team now in his trial, let's cut to the arrest. How did this all come out? Where were you? What happened? What is it? What happened? You're working. Doreen's working. Kristen's in college. And in 2001, after your mom passed away, like just literally months, something happened. Can you talk us through now what Greg Ridgway went through there? Greg, what you went through.
Well, I'll include that. Let me back up a little bit, because there's some really good background that will help people understand what was going on. The 80s was when it all happened. People don't realize, and it never came out much, that the FBI was involved in the 80s as well. But the FBI was involved, and we believe that they even wiretapped phones and did all that kind of stuff, which they did quite frequently back then. And I kind of blew them off. I was not a very nice guy back then. I'm sure that there are plenty of recordings out there of me cussing at the FBI. But they confiscated.
What do you mean? What do you mean? This is like in the 80s. What do you mean? Like with Gary? How were you involved with the FBI in the 80s?
They had three prime suspects in the 80s: Gary, a cab driver, and an outdoorsman. And they believed that this Green River Killer was either a police officer or a police officer wannabe. My dad thought he was a police officer. They thought it was an outdoorsman, and I just laughed at that because I spent plenty of time outdoors, and Gary wasn't an outdoorsman. He played with the investigators a lot with his crime scenes, but he wasn't an outdoorsman. And there was a cab driver that was at a number of this. He was with or around the women, those early several that were found in the Green River. So, and then the FBI got involved, and I think this all kind of comes back around because Reichert was a rookie police officer in those initial crime scenes in the Green River where the bodies were dressed up with, different items on the bodies and all that. Don't know where Gary came up with those ideas. I never thought he could do that. But anyway, Reichert was caught with egg all over his face in those early years because he didn't have a clue. The police department at one point in time had a major computer crash. They lost all their records. They didn't have any of them backed up. So they kept bungling one thing after the other, and a lot of that fell in his lap. He was the one that was tasked with finding the Green River Killer. And he was the one that he was always the kind of guy that wanted to be public facing, kind of like an actor. He always wanted to be on the other end of the camera. He always wanted to be the one that had all the solutions and had the answers and everything. That's why he's a congressman, I guess. But back then, he didn't get anywhere. He never got anywhere even close to Gary. But he was relatively good in collecting evidence. So he was one of the people that was at a lot of the crime scenes collecting evidence. That ended up coming back 20 years later and one of those DNA swabs actually, when DNA testing got better, actually revealed him to be the Green River Killer.
Right.
They were able to identify him based on DNA evidence. It was a very small sample.
They had gotten in the 80s and just kept it, right?
Yeah, and Reichert was the reason they kept it. But the reason why Reichert was so passionate about everything and so diligent about it is because he had egg all over his face for 4 or 5 years in a row. And then that whole thing went cold. And Gary kind of went underground, so to speak. And
it went cold in like 86 on. There was only like one person on the case.
According to Gary, he only had the urge roughly once or twice a year after that.
So that's why they figured there was probably another 20 people at 1 or 2 a year over the course of the next 20 years.
And Gary acknowledges that. Is very he's the first one to tell you that arresting him and putting him away was the right thing to do. He knew he had a problem, and he knew he couldn't erase it from his urges. It's like a person who has a gambling problem. He just couldn't get rid of it, or a drinking problem.
Yeah, no, I mean, I was a drug addict. I had addiction issues. So, I was doing a heck of a lot better than I was in my most active years, but it was addiction lingers. It lingers for 20 years, yeah.
And then when they tested that sample, his name came up, and that's and when that interesting day, and it's I don't want to bash the police because I think they're wonderful, but Reichert was not. He still is not, and I don't mind bashing him because he was as much of an impediment as he was a solution to any given situation. But when it came time to reveal the evidence, Seattle Police Department had a specific, very documented procedure on how to deal with an arrest and how to deal with revealing a suspect. He violated all of it. We, all three of us, Ed and I both got called in by detectives and had our interviews with detectives and about Gary and everything. It was kind of revealed to us when Ed and I were in the computer store buying computer parts, and we get a phone call, and it's a detective, and he says, we need to meet you at your mom's house. And we were 5 minutes away, so we just drove up there, and they separated us and interrogated us and did all that. But
is this you and Ed?
Ed
or
and
Doreen?
I, yeah.
Okay. Doreen was working?
Doreen wasn't involved at all. They weren't even interested in never were interested in a female accomplice at all.
But they wanted to talk to you guys about possibly being accomplices.
Don't know what their motives were. They questioned us. We gave them, honest answers for all their questions. Where we were basically at a position where I returned home. We returned to Mom and Dad's house, and we walked in the front door, and there were detectives and police officers all throughout the house. My mom and dad didn't have a very big house, 800 square feet or thereabouts.
Oh. And
probably 8 uniformed cops and a couple of detectives and a female police officer and everything else were in there. And we had the TV on, and the police were, the uniformed officers were great. Good to me all the way along the line. But anyway, they said, well, do you mind if we turn on the TV? Because they were going to announce that evening how did that go? He was not supposed to announce that day. Reichert was not supposed to announce that day. We were all gathered around, and I overheard conversations between the uniformed officers. They were saying, well, no, he won't. No, he won't. He won't. He won't. He won't reveal it today. He won't put that on national news. No, he won't do that. Well, he did. He was supposed to wait at least 24 hours so they could cross their T's and dot their I's and do all the things that police are supposed to do. He didn't do any of that. He just immediately
He announced the name, or that he was captured? He released the name? Or just
not only the name, but that he was in custody. He jumped the gun by over 24 hours, and he did it for his own,
right?
Because this was his shortcoming for all those years, is he was never able to catch him, and he couldn't wait to tell anybody, even though the procedures told him not to do that. So,
but just so I'm clear, did you see that live on TV, or you caught that later?
No, we were there in my mom and dad's living room.
Way.
And he came out there and announced it in that national news and in front of
the whole world.
In front of the whole world. Without following protocol, without doing what he was supposed to do. And everybody, you should have seen, every police officer in the room dropped their heads, turned, and they dispersed. We had 8 uniformed police officers and some detectives, and I had an empty house 30 seconds later. Because they didn't want to be heard talking about what just happened.
But they already had talked to you, so you already knew.
I already knew that I don't know that
but the privacy around it now is gone. Now everyone knows that your brother is the one that is being accused.
We have no opportunity to prepare ourselves or do anything on our own. We were all blindsided. The police were blindsided. I was blindsided. Everyone was blindsided.
So now let's bring in Doreen a little bit. So did she hear it live too, where she was?
She was at work. It happened at 4:00 in the afternoon. I think within the first minute of the 4:00 news. So, I mean, that was a headline news.
And then what about Kristen? Where's Kristen? She's in college in California, so she's not hearing Seattle news live from there. But is it you who call her, Doreen who calls her, or probably Doreen, right? Or is it even the same day? Are you like, wait, we don't want to say anything to Kristen yet? Or is it a quick call to his third wife? What's his third wife's name? Judith. Is it now Judith that you're involved with? We
ended up calling Judith shortly that evening, I believe.
You went home. Okay.
I wanted to find out what was going on. Doreen heard it at work, and I just now remember, because the man who she ended up bringing in was, he knew the state AG, this one lawyer, what was his name? I'm trying to remember. Anyway, he ended up bowing out of the case after a while because he couldn't deal with it. He was ready to retire, so he retired and bowed out of it.
Oh yeah, he was really a good person. He was just a little too old to really want to take on a big case like this. He was famous, right? He had done famous cases, I think, on this level.
And he was the one that saved Gary's life. He was the one that talked to the Attorney General directly and said, "Look, if I can get this guy to turn himself in, admit what he's done, will you save his life?" So,
right.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember his name, but anyway,
you don't have to worry about it because there's plenty of information about there. That's public record stuff. We're more interested in the stuff like what I'm interested in. The liquid bliss part about this, or just the part I'm interested in, is so you saw that. So now everyone has to be involved, right? You have to now take on an energy of now publicly this is out there.
So, and we had already. My mom had already passed, so we'd already dealt with some unfortunate interpersonal relationships with Judith. We thought Gary was cheap, but I tell this to everybody, Judith was cheaper than Gary.
They were garage sailors, right? They had a lot of garage sales. Sales and dogs. Forgive me, I'm going to hold my rock.
I was the executor of the estate, and before Mom was even put in the grave, so to speak, Gary was running around putting stickers on everything in the house that he wanted, which I thought was...
Oh, man.
And then Judith was right behind him.
Fucker.
And then they just says, "Well, look, I'm a." Gary said, "Well, I'm a." Every weekend he was at the local drive-in selling his wares, so he was a garage sale guy. And they had a three. I was the executor, so I had to handle the money, but I told them what they could or couldn't mark up and walk off with. But they said they'd sit the house because I was working. They said, we'll sit the house and we'll sell the mom's stuff that we didn't want. And the beginning of the second day, Judith came to me and she said, Greg, I said, I got great news. She says, I got 395 big ones for you. I'm going, oh, look all this, sharing $395 in that first day and a half. And she says, I'll bring it tomorrow. So I met with her after work the next day, and she handed me an envelope. Had $3.95 in small change in it, after 3 days of an estate sale.
Does that mean she pocketed the rest, or that didn't sell anything?
Wouldn't talk about it.
I missed something there. Did they just not sell it, or did she take the money? So she just took the money? And she thought she pulled some weird dynamic of a weird adolescent child that would try to give you $3.95 and pretend she meant that instead. I said $3.95, but I'll let him think I meant $4 like that. It's not 400. Oh,
yeah.
That's what we're dealing with. And again, Judith is her own innocent victim in all this. But again, I'm talking about the dynamics of Gary and Judith now. So Gary, this isn't the other component about Gary, is he is a cheapskate among cheapskates, to the point where even with these girls, he would take back the $20. There was a dynamic in there that even goes so deep that it was about motherfucker, give me my money back. And he would get his money back from these women. That was a component in it too. My $20. I mean, it's so Hollywood. I mean, the guy who gets to play him to win the Oscar, that's going to be a fun bit to play. It's this is an insane component, and this is the energy you're around. This is your two brothers, and you got your own things that you can't even deal with. This is one thing about my father-in-law that I love. It's he takes on other people's psychology, or understands what they're about, or he's able to tell us so much right now about Ed and Gary. We can go on forever. I find he won't take care of himself in that same way. He won't allow that same care for himself. So man, these situations, your brother, this is twisted.
I mean, yeah, it's twisted. And then that's what people understand. There's so much twisted, bizarre BS that went on during that time period that somehow I got on the estate sale deal. But
it was because it was right before. It was because your mom died right before the arrest happened. What you had said, what got us on the kick was, I'm tracking this, was that you had just dealt with the loss of your mom, and then now, boom, here's Gary accused, and I'm in the public carrying it all.
We had to figure out how Gary was going to establish a defense, because lawyers aren't cheap. And you mentioned Judith, and I went on a tangent, but go back to the point we were at 10 minutes ago, is that we had to come up with money. And the obvious thing was selling the house, right? This is the first day. We already know. I mean, we already got advice from the lead attorney that we need to come up with a way for Gary to, the state would have provided additional attorneys because it's a high-profile case, but you still need to be able to provide a defense for yourself. So what we did is we were actually right out in front of the jail when I called and talked to Judith, and all she could say was, "Well, if we sell a house, what am I going to do?" She didn't care about her husband. She wasn't disturbed by the fact that he was accused of being a serial killer. She wasn't concerned about anything but her own welfare.
See, on that level, I mean, if you're a wife you can't know what your husband's up to, but like you said, on your third level, again, Judith is not someone I will ever speak ill of, but in a way of understanding where I come from with my understanding of Judith is, she was disassociated from that whole thing. And it was really just about like, what about me? You know, what about like she was incapable of again, you stood in the gap for Gary. His wife couldn't do it. I would think if something happened with me, my wife Kristen would stand in the gap for me, not my brother Johnny. So the fact that you had to do it instead of Judith speaks nothing bad about Judith. It just goes to say that what you were really, it was always going to be on you. And then Doreen. So you and Doreen took on all of that energy for 2 full years and got him the best team you could possibly want. And what was that like for you when the paint stuff came in and all of a sudden it can't be, all of a sudden it's true. What was that like for Greg?
Well, you know, during this, I'll just mention one more story about Judith, because it's important to understand his home environment. And she was his choice. He loved her. At the end, regardless of what her social flaws may have been, I mean, we had a number of times when we had to get together with Judith, and one time we got together, she said she wanted to go to a movie because we said we'd go to a movie that night. And I'll never forget this. I said, well, knowing her, I said, well, Judith, we'll take you down. We'll drive you down and we'll take you home. We'll take you down to the movie, but you got to pay the matinee. She had to pay her fare. $3.88 with tax. That's what it was. She stood us up for 5 minutes at the ticket booth, refusing to pay until I finally said, okay, Judith, I'll take you home, before she paid $3.88 to go to a movie. That's the environment that's the chemistry or ethos or whatever you want to call it that Gary was living.
It's why they kind of found, like, they had dogs, they had their garage sales. They really did work together. They found, you know, everyone finds someone like themselves. That really was the one that, like, they weren't going to divorce if he hadn't been caught. If he hadn't been caught, they would still be together in 2025.
I'm sure they will.
So that's what's insane. So let's get back on track, because again, you're bypassing me now by wanting to go back and talk about Judith. How did you feel when it happened and all of a sudden you defended him for 2 full years and now this is becoming irrefutable? Like, how did my father-in-law, who I know is all based in logic, and a lot of times when it comes to like evidence and stuff, I want to get past that even. How did you feel, Greg? I mean, like not just like one word, but like what happened there?
The paint evidence is important. And I think this is something that, in hindsight, if I was going to stick a pin in it and say something I really felt good about, Doreen and I together felt good about. We visited him every week in jail, in the county jail in downtown Seattle, every week. My brother Ed often didn't show up. But we were there when the news hit about the paint evidence. And this paint, apparently, when you use an aerosol sprayer, you're painting vehicles, trucks, Class 8 trucks all day. It gets in your clothes, it gets in your hair, it gets everywhere, right? Well, what gets in it is these little tiny paint globules, like little glass balls that flow through the air and harden, and then they land on your clothing. Well, this one particular lady was found in a construction site, and she was still partly clothed and was wearing a sweater that had paint evidence in the fibers of the sweater. And I had just heard that, and we'd been talking to Gary regularly, and at this point in time, everything was beginning to stack up. The scientific evidence was there, and I'm a scientist, and I follow those things. So Doreen and I were sitting across the glass from me, and I was talking to him, and I said, Gary, this is really bad. I can't tell you any different. I says, you said you didn't do it. He says, I respect that. He says, I said, but I'm not sure I believe you anymore. I said, here's what's going to happen, Gary. So you need to imagine a situation 6 months or a year or 5 years from now where you're sitting in a courtroom and they bring in all these specialists and all these scientists, and they're all bringing in big posters. All these posters have pictures of paint globules on them, all from whatever brand of paint that happened to be that was used commercially on Kenworth trucks. And I said, it's going to look really bad. I said, you can talk DNA evidence all day long to a jury. I said, but the jury's not going to understand that. They don't understand what DNA is. I'm not sure I understand what DNA is. I said, but I'll tell you what, everybody's run a paint gun once in their life. Everybody's sprayed a spray can. They all know what paint is. Everybody knows that. All the do-it-yourselfers in that jury are going to know what paint's all about. And I said, they're going to bring, they're going to have arrows, and they're going to have circles, and they're going to show this, and they're going to show that, and they're going to show all their evidence. People can eat it up. I said, at that point, Gary, you're cooked. You have no choice. You can't refute that in any way. I still didn't accuse him. He still had not admitted that he'd done it. But we left that evening in the jail, and the next day he went to the female lead on the defense team and confessed and said, I did it. But it was because of the evidence that Dorian and I brought to him and the logic that we brought to him the night before is the reason he confessed. He knew at that point in time he was cooked. He was done. But what he told the Michelle, the defense attorney, what he told her is, well, I didn't want to do it because I was afraid that my brother and his wife would get a divorce when they found out I was who I was. So at that point in time, yep, he showed empathy at that point in time for Dorian and my situation. I imagine somewhere in that conversation he slipped in, well, even if I did it, would you guys still be together? He may have said that. I don't know. He's the kind of person you could 4 hours with and not.
Yeah. You know what I'm piecing together right now is, like, I keep asking you how you feel, and I'm understanding right now as I realize it, you didn't have time to feel back then. When you're going through a 2-year case that's nonstop like that, you are in survival mode. I do those Dr. Joe Dispenza meditations, right? And the whole thing is about getting out of these 3 lower centers, which is like our sexual primal center, our gut reaction center, and our I got to force myself and have my will happen. Those are the first 3 centers. And that's where we survive. That's a saber-toothed tiger chasing us. We're going to get the fuck out of there. We're done. Most of the time, though, we still live in those centers, even though there's no more saber-tooth tigers, because we're just geared that way. We live mostly in these three energy centers down here. That's how it is. So the whole point of any, mainstream religion, like spiritual practice is to, and you get to your upper 3 ones, which is like your heart and your voice and your third eye and your throat and these are the ones where, like, gratitude, it's like it's creative spaces where you can make stuff happen, and that's where your feelings are, and you can look at your feelings and stuff like that, and that would be fine and dandy. But I keep asking you the questions, and I'm like, yeah, he can't answer that because at this point you're in survival mode. This is now a 2-year trial that is 24/7, not 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Your wife is able to keep up with it because she was a paralegal and knows exactly what to do. So she's on top of this case as much as any of the investigators, any of the lawyers. So you, by osmosis, are more involved than you ever would have been with something, whether you like it or not. There is no break for you. You might try to have a break, but it's just not happening because that's not how it works in these high profile cases. And so when I say, how did it feel when you found out it was pay chips? You're like, dude, I'm in the thick of it. That's like asking me how it felt when I'm in the middle of Vietnam or in the middle of Korea, like in the middle of when a soldier's in a fight. This is what's happening, Dom. And so I'm telling you, yeah, it was paint chips, logic, boom. He confessed. Thank God. And he said, Doreen and I probably would get divorced over this whole thing. And I don't know, you and Doreen were probably not like necessarily in any kind of mode, except like, we're fucking got to do this. This is how it goes. Right. And I'm sure it was a hard tested 2.5 years or whatever it was. But like, in some ways it's like having to carry that energy, and we'll go back here. I'm going to do tangent back, but like having to go in that energy of because I got to know you in 2008. So this is like 5 years after the fact. 2007, 2008, I met you. This is 5 years after Gary. So I got to go through 16 years of the Gary saga. And it's kind of like, when have you guys had time to ever decompress it all and go into a feeling place about it? Because then you went into caretaker mode of like having to like talk to him every week and like stay involved. And this became this very interesting dynamic that like, it's the hardest one for me to like put together still, which is like something happened in this trial. And then he goes to jail for life. And then I don't know how soon he starts calling you or not calling you, but a dynamic starts where you stay in contact with him, you and Doreen. And Doreen's a talker, so I'm sure she did most of the talking, and you're probably talked to him too. But like, what was that like? I don't want to jump too forward in there, but like this, you're still on this roller coaster since the whole thing happened. That was like, when do you get off the roller coaster kind of thing? Are you there? So Greg, you there?
Yep.
Okay. So right now Greg's out of power. So what we're going to do is if he comes back, we'll log back in and talk to him more. Otherwise we'll talk to him probably tomorrow. And then we'll get into a whole nother piece of this. And I think this is going really well. How are you feeling, Greg, about how it's going?
I think it's going very well. Yeah. What's weird is that I thought I had my house protected from this because we had a bunch of problems with power in the fall because they were doing upgrades on the power equipment. But apparently, I've got all these UPSs that are up and running, but they're not.
Well, I want to suggest something cosmic here. Think about your house that you've built, right? You built this after the Green River Killer. You went to Seattle. You built every stitch of it. And now that we're in the middle of a remodel, Kristen and I understand. And you're in it as much as your daughter's in it. She is in this remodel the way you were with your house. It's a beautiful thing. And this house is where you chose to do the podcast from, because this house is your safe place. Your house is almost alive. I've been in that house. It has a life to it that's almost alive. That's why it's going to be a forever house and a legacy house. But at the same time, it's like, I know it's the electricity being out and all. It's just interesting. It's almost like the house is like, this is enough for right now. We'll continue more. Greg he's taking care of you, and Greg needs to kind of decompress now. We don't need to do a 4-hour podcast. We can do it in pieces. So we've already gone almost 2 hours. We're about an hour and 40 minutes in. And so when we regroup, we'll have new energy and we'll do it again. And that way it's not, you know what I mean? And that's just how I see life these days. And I'm so like stoked that you're in your house, because your house is a whole thing. And I want to get into a lot with you. And we'll do a podcast that's in 2 parts. And then we'll put a lot of this interview behind a paid wall, and people who really want to understand all the psychology of what we're talking and the spiritual ramifications, they'll all be able to have that footage too. So we have a lot planned to be able to hold space for you, keep, you know what I mean? We have an infrastructure for you, Greg, so that you can like keep this and let it be what it needs to be and let it breathe and move where it wants to move. Does that make sense?
No, that makes sense. Yeah. No. By the way, I did keep a lot of it up. I have TV, but apparently whatever happened also hit Doris, California, which is where our internet comes from.
Yeah. So we're done.
Apparently we lost, it's not back up yet. So
the glitch in the matrix. Hey, listen, so let's do this again. I'll figure out a time tomorrow and we'll regroup it. And and then we'll keep going. All right. Sound good?
Okay.
Well, Steven and I will talk. We'll figure out his schedule and a time we can get back in here. And it's going to be beautiful. All right. Sound good?
All right.
All right.
Sounds good.
I love you, man. This was good. So far, so good. Part 1 done.